This is a lecture on Plato's dialogue, Crito. I am David Hildebrand from the University of Colorado, Denver. Let's begin with the big picture and then do an outline of what we'll talk about in this lecture. So, Plato's Crito is a classic text both in the history of philosophy and in the history of civil disobedience, because Socrates is faced with a decision. Should he disobey the laws of Athens and escape from prison? Or should he follow the laws and accept his penalty, which is death? So the Crito is a dialogue in which we see Crito, a friend of Socrates, pressing Socrates to escape and arguing that this is the best thing to do. Socrates, we will see, argues that he must not escape. And the case is not an easy one for the readers, but it is for Socrates. And the dialogue raises some very important questions. Why does Socrates decide to accept his punishment? What reasons does Crito offer for escape, and why doesn't Socrates accept them? And what larger ethical principle is Socrates defending by accepting his punishment? Finally, how is Socrates living what we might call a good or a meaningful life by, paradoxically, dying? These I take to be the central questions at stake in Plato's dialogue for us. So here's an outline of the talk that I'll give in a moment. First, we'll talk about the big picture, which I just did, and then we'll look at the anchoring principle of Socrates, the idea that virtue is knowledge. We'll give an outline for Plato's dialogue, the Crito, and then we'll look at the setup of what's happening in the beginning of the dialogue. Then we'll look at Crito's arguments, some of the dominant themes there, and Socrates' refutations. And we'll see that Socrates is actually making a fairly radical ethical move, one that we've seen him make in a couple of other dialogues, particularly in the Apology. We'll see that two basic principles have to obtain if Socrates is going to escape from prison. One is the principle that one must never do wrong willingly, and the other is that free and fair agreements must be kept. Then we'll look at three choices that Socrates says we have when we disagree with the state in which we live. And we'll consider finally whether or not Socrates should have escaped because this was a flawed trial, and this gives him perhaps an escape clause to the arguments that he's been making all throughout the dialogue. Finally, we'll review what Socrates' basic ethical creed is as enunciated in this dialogue, and we'll take a look at the ending. Let's think about the anchoring principle of Socrates, the idea that virtue is knowledge. What does he mean by this? Well, think about the principle, virtue is knowledge. Well, what follows from that for Socrates that is, if virtue is knowledge, then no one does evil willingly. And this is a very important Socratic principle. To know the good is to do the good. So, for example, to know that stealing is wrong is to not steal. So for Socrates, doing evil is a kind of ignorance, an ignorance of what is truly good. So you might consider an objection for a moment. You might, let's say you steal something in a store, a candy bar or something. You might think, well, I knew better, but I stole anyway. This is a pretty typical thing to say. Socrates' response to this is that it's absurd. Because if you really had better judgment, you would have acted upon it. In other words, for Socrates, knowing something is a state of mind that necessitates action. You might think of this in the context of someone who says, I know French. I know French means that I speak French without needing to choose each word or phrase, consciously. It means just being able to do it. So, in Socrates' account, wrongdoers don't know good and choose wrong. Rather, they are mistaken about the good. So the thief doesn't think that he's doing evil or she's doing evil. He or she thinks that they're stealing because this is what's going to be good for them. It's going to bring them wealth. The mistake there is thinking that the good is made up by wealth, rather than thinking that the good is made up by an honest character or a healthy soul or a healthy character. So people who are wealth seekers, or people whose lives are oriented around fame, trying to be famous, well thought of, and so forth, they spend their whole life basically with that goal orienting them and directing their actions, their majors, their choices, their job, their relationships. They are striving for luxury. They are striving for wealth. They are striving for fame or reputation. And in all of these cases, they think that what they're doing is good. And what Socrates' point is that they are mistaking the good for fame or the good for wealth. And because they identify these things with happiness, right, rather than with an honest character, they are making a fundamental mistake. They are fundamentally ignorant. They're not willingly doing wrong, right? They're pursuing what they think is good, but they're ignorant of what is truly good for human beings, what will truly bring happiness. They are living an unexamined life. We think of this quite naturally when we think of people who are, let's say, just to use a dramatic example, serial killers. The serial killer might think that their mission on earth is to kill as many people as possible and get away with it. They might enjoy it, they might not, but this is clearly the mission as they see it. We would think that person is fundamentally misguided. They have no idea what they're doing. We might even say that they're mentally not holding a full deck of cards. But Socrates is saying that that same sort of lack of understanding is characteristic of the person who orients their life around wealth or fame or other things besides the virtues. So, in sum, for Socrates, the idea that virtue is knowledge means that excellence of character, of the virtues, right? Courage and honesty, magnanimity, that genuine success, excellence of character, or genuine success and fulfillment in human life is determined above all by one's understanding, especially the understanding of what's good and bad. And this kind of genuine understanding will yield moral actions, and those will yield a happy life in its best construal, in its most rational construal. Let's take a brief look at the structure of the dialogue. The first section, the scene of the dialogue is set, and in the second section, Crito's arguments are offered. We also see there Socrates' response, and we think about the sort of range of arguments that Crito is offering. In the third section, we see Socrates' basic appeal to discussion as a way of understanding ourselves and what to do in morally difficult situations. And in the fourth section, we see what's called the speech of the laws, and this is where Socrates makes the case that he has to obey the laws of Athens, and how we take a stance or how we figure out what stance to take vis-a-vis a state that seems to be doing something that we disagree with. The fifth section, we see the conclusion. So let's talk about the setup in the dialogue. Socrates has been in jail for about a month because a day after his sentence was passed, a ship was sent to pay homage to Apollo in Delos, and no executions were allowed while the ship was away. Now, Crito, Socrates' friend, has been visiting him throughout the month, and now he's making one more plea for Socrates to escape. And he's going to use all of the reasons, all of the rhetoric that he can muster to convince Socrates to escape. What are the arguments that Crito makes for Socrates to escape? What are the reasons that he gives? Well, one reason that he gives is that if Socrates dies, that he, Crito, will be deprived of an unusual friend. He also argues that his reputation will suffer, right? People will think that he didn't try to save Socrates or that he was too cheap to bribe the right people to get Socrates out of jail. He makes the case that, look, if Socrates escapes, he can live somewhere else. He could even go to Thessaly, where he would be greeted by appreciative friends. He argues also that death is the worst thing that a person can suffer, right? That people should avoid death at all costs. He also makes the case that if Socrates were to die, he would not be a good father, that he would be dodging his duty as a father by dying. And this is in conflict with Socrates' claim that people should be virtuous, right? They should live up to their duties. As you think about the different arguments that Crito makes, you might notice that there's a dominant theme or a theme that recurs. And that theme is that for Crito, doing the right thing is equivalent to avoiding shame in the eyes of the majority. And this was a deeply held Greek attitude, and I think that a lot of us still think the same way, right? We look to others to see what the right thing to do is. We look to see what other people will say or think if we do something, and this is one of the things that makes social media so powerful. Crito is arguing in a number of these cases, in a number of these arguments, don't look bad, and don't make me look bad by dying, Socrates. The right thing to do is the thing that looks right to most people. So we might look at the dialogue after this section and think, Well, how does Socrates respond to these arguments? What does he think of them? Well, he refutes them, and he is going to refute the central idea that what's right to do is the thing that most people think is right. And he gives the following argument. He says, consider the opinions of other people. Do we value some of their opinions or all of them? And to that the response is, well, we only value some opinions, not everyone's opinion. And Socrates says, well, whose opinions do we value? And to that the response is, well, we value the opinions of those who are wise. We value good opinions. And then Socrates says, well, heeding wise opinions benefits someone, while heeding unwise opinions hurts someone, right? And this seems pretty obvious. And he gives this analogy with health of the soul as being something akin to or analogous to health of the body. So Socrates concludes from this argument that we should not be concerned with majority opinion. We should live by the wise opinion. And so therefore, Socrates also concludes that living itself is not what's valuable. Living wisely is. This is what it means to live a good life. So let's consider a little bit further this doctor analogy that Socrates gives. Socrates says, listen, no one who has a corrupt or painfully diseased body wants to live. And he says, analogously, no one truly wants to live with an unjust and wicked soul. The health of the body is analogous to the virtue of the soul. And so a healthy or ethical life requires virtue. Socrates is making a fairly radical ethical move at this point. He is replacing the criterion for whether something is right or wrong, right? The idea that shame is the way we determine what's right, what other people think. He's replacing that by rationality, by a reverence for truth. So shame is being replaced by a reverence for truth. And he's replacing the criterion for what it means to live a happy life, where he's saying most people think that pleasure, wealth, fame, and success are what we're after in this life. And he's saying, no, that's the wrong measure of success. Success is attaining justice. So Socrates lays this out because what he wants Crito to understand is that if he's willing to escape, it will have to be because he has made a decision that was based on reason and argument, not on majority opinion. So the source of morality is reason, not opinion or desire, whether that's the desire for other people's approval or the desire just to save one's skin or right to go by other people's opinion. No, it has to be based on reason alone. Socrates also states that if he's going to escape, he has to see whether or not two basic principles are in force or not. The two principles are, one, that one must never do wrong willingly, not even in response to a wrong, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. And the second principle is that free and fair agreements must be kept. So Socrates needs to understand that if he escapes, is he doing a wrong willingly? Because if he is, he can't escape. And the other question is, does he have any free and fair agreements that he'll be breaking if he escapes? And if he's going to be breaking any free and fair agreements, he has to stay. Let's look at that first principle, the idea that one must never do wrong willingly. Why does Socrates believe that one must never harm someone, even if that person harmed you first? Well, he says it's never right to do wrong, not even in retaliation. And you can see this in the Crito at 49b through e. And he also says it's better to be wronged than to wrong another. Why is this? Because he believes that the true self is not the body, but the soul or the character. And the soul is where knowledge of virtue and vice reside. The soul might be immortal or it might not be immortal. Socrates is unsure and the argument doesn't depend on it. He believes, though, that true harm is harm to the soul. And he says in the Apology, you might remember, that it's wrong to do wrong to another person. So you might compare Crito at 47d and 49b with Apology at 30d. Therefore, it's better to be wrong than to wrong another. Remember, he says in the Apology that the only ones who can harm me are myself. You can kill me, but you cannot harm me, because the only way to harm my soul is to do harm to another. One thing to notice in this part of the dialogue is that Socrates' idea of punishment is that it must be rehabilitative and not retributive. Punishment, wherever possible, has to have education and reform as its goal. And take a look at Apology 26e on this question. So since those who do harm are ignorant, not evil, punishment may not be mere retribution or retaliation. Since virtue is knowledge, the way to make people better is through education, like the education that Socrates is trying to give people through the procedure of the elenchus, through questioning and answering, exposing contradictions, and leading back to another try at a definition or an account of the virtues. So retribution as a theory of punishment is the norm in Athens, and Socrates is saying that such a theory is backwards looking. It tries to do what's right by seeing what has happened. Instead, Socrates is saying justice should be concerned with the future health, the future growth of the soul of the individual, the soul of the city. It doesn't matter. Justice is helped by doing what is good for the soul, and punishment must educate, if it can, and not just satisfy a thirst for vengeance or retribution. Let's look at the second principle, the one about free and fair agreements. We have to determine if Socrates has been in a free and fair agreement with Athens. The first thing to consider is this idea that someone should always obey a rule or a principle. Socrates is saying that it's not the case that one must always obey a rule or a law. The question then becomes, well, when should you obey? And Socrates says, well, you should not keep an agreement. You should not obey a law or a rule if justice won't be served. So take this example. A friend asks you to hang on to her gun while she goes on a trip. On the trip, she develops some mental issues and she comes back insane, and she asks for her gun back. And now look, a free and fair agreement which should not be kept is what's happening here. Why? I mean, she asked, will you hold my gun, and when I come back, will you give it back to me? And you say yes, but she goes insane while she's on the trip. She comes back and asks for her gun, and you won't give it back. Why? Because justice would not be kept by giving a gun to an insane person. So notice the principle here that Socrates is articulating. The idea is that promises should be kept when justice is served, not the idea that justice is served whenever promises are kept. Just keeping a promise doesn't necessarily serve the ends of justice. Let's think about this idea of an agreement or a contract between Socrates and Athens. Did Socrates have an agreement with the state? Think about that. He gives a number of reasons why Socrates has an agreement with the state. For one thing, his parents were married by the state of Athens. He grew up there. He got education there. He got care from Athens. He didn't leave when he turned 18, when he could have left. He got married himself and had a family in Athens. And he lived his whole life there without leaving. And so he looks at the course of his life, the benefits that he's received, and his chances and opportunities to leave at various points, and he thinks, no, this is a free and fair contract. This agreement was free and fair. So then the question becomes, okay, well, let's say you have a free and fair contract with the state. At that point, what choices do you have if an injustice crops up? What are your options? At that point, there are three choices you can follow if you're in a state of disagreement with the state. One is that you can persuade the state to change, right? You could do this with demonstrations, with letters, with boycotts, with lobbying, right? There are any number of ways that you can persuade the state to take a different course of action. Depends on the issue. You could choose to obey the laws, right? Obviously, that's the most obvious one. You disagree with the state, but you just go ahead and obey anyway. The last thing that you can do is leave the country. So Socrates has an agreement with the state of Athens that's free and fair. He has an opportunity to persuade the state. He has had an opportunity when he was younger to leave the country, but neither of those options are operative anymore, and now the only thing left for him is to obey. Now, you might consider an objection at this point. You might consider the objection, well, look, Socrates had a trial, okay, but it was way too short. It seems like he was being prosecuted on political motives and political grounds. It seems like it was just a show to get rid of Socrates. So why should Socrates accept this as part of the bargain? So you might consider an example. If you wrong me and I strike back at you, that's not wrong. It's made right by the fact that you wronged me first. That's retribution, and it's justice too. This is the kind of argument that often is raised to Socrates. Look, you had a flawed trial. You would be escaping, but you would just be striking back at the state which was harming you. Okay, so let's consider again in more depth this flawed trial consideration. Why would Socrates consider escaping a form of injustice in the event that the trial was in fact flawed? Well, one possibility, Socrates could argue, is that, look, when one accepts citizenship in a legal system, they agreed to abide by the laws and the legal process, even though they know there are mistakes, and there are going to be mistakes. One accepts the whole package, even though it will contain some imperfections. So there's a fundamental obedience at stake in Socrates' case, and that obedience is to the authority of law itself. The state, he says, is like a parent. It has the right to punish. That right is basic, and it doesn't go away just because a particular judgment is in error. So even if it were true that Socrates was wronged in this trial, it doesn't follow that he has the right to return injustice that they served on him with the injustice of escaping any more than he has the right to avoid the military service when he was younger. Socrates' creed, as it's enunciated here, I think we can summarize in the following way. Never commit injustice. Injustice harms the soul, and a damaged soul is not worth living for. So again, Athens can only harm Socrates' body, not his soul. In Socrates' case, obeying the law, namely that the verdicts of juries in such cases are to be obeyed, doesn't require that he commit injustice, only that he suffer injustice. So Socrates has always maintained, even in the face of death, that it's better to suffer injustice than commit it. If that is happening here in his own case, with his trial, it is still the principle by which he feels bound to live. So in the end, Socrates chooses to remain in prison and accept his sentence. He's considered the alternatives, he's weighed the different justifications as they relate to his ethical principles, and his choice to stay in prison and to accept his punishment is the most rational one by his reasoning, and is therefore the one that is the most just. He must live in a way that's just, because living in a way that's just is a way of not harming his own soul, which would occur if he committed the injustice of escaping. Therefore, he must accept the sentence. He must accept his death. Socrates raises a profound question, I think, in this dialogue for all of us, namely, what are we willing to die for? What are you willing to die for? Or to put the question in a slightly different way, what kind of life is not worth living? The answer from Socrates' perspective is an unjust one. Therefore, one must live justly by examining their life every day, discussing virtue, working towards the best possible accounts of what it means to be a generous person, a wise person, a courageous person, an intelligent person, a generous person, or must be willing to give up their life. That concludes this lecture on Plato's dialogue, Crito. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to discussing it with you.